Welcome to St. Paul's. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Stephen King. I serve as rector here or senior pastor here, and it is our honor and delight to have you with us on this night. I have, at this point in the order of events, I have three basic jobs. I've already accomplished one, which is to welcome you. The second is to ask your generosity in support of this work at the back with a contribution to support these artists who give so much of their talent and their gifts to this community on this night. And the third is just to introduce our the featured show, I guess, the stars of the show, and to let you know that at the end, Kurt and Forrest will be taking your questions. So as you hear them and as you consider all that's being offered tonight, I hope you also consider a question which you might offer for them and towards the end of our program. So, Kurt Knecht is the organist here at St. Paul's. Will introduce themselves. Forrest Pierce, and then, yeah. And then you'll, of course, hear the beautiful singing of Sarah Anderson, which we can't wait to hear. Welcome, everybody.
Again, welcome to everybody, and especially friends from the Muslim community. I know it's not always easy to step into a door of a church, so we're thankful that you took that step of courage and came out tonight. In the Episcopal Church, this is the season of Epiphany, and we start that season by telling a story of Magi that came and visited Jesus at, a little bit after his birth, bringing gifts. And that's an interesting thing that we start telling our story about who we are by a visitation of people that are from a different faith tradition. The scholars tell us that they were probably Zoroastrians, and they come bringing gifts. And it's my conviction that people that are coming from other faith traditions still have gifts to offer to us. So when I conceived of this project and of having a sort of public dialogue, there was nobody else that I could think of doing this with than Forrest. Forrest is an amazing musician, but I didn't invite him here in that capacity tonight. If you want to read about that, turn over your program and you can read about that stuff. I invited Forrest to do this because Forrest and I disagree with each other. And at least I think we do. At least sometimes when I talk, sometimes when we talk, I think we don't disagree, that we just talk about things differently. But I think we really do have some dogmatic kinds of differences occasionally, and I've always found Forrest to be a safe place to discuss those things in, and I believe that that is the best hope for the future of our world that's become so tribal and divided, when people that actually disagree can talk about differences in a respectful way. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Forrest a few questions about his practices, and then we're going to do a piece that Forrest wrote for this evening. Sarah's going to sing that, and then Forrest is going to ask me some questions, and we're going to do my piece, and then Father Stephen is going to field some questions and answers from you. So with that, I think we should get started. You want to sit down? So we sort of became friends talking about our prayer lives and similarities between them. So I would love to know, to start with, when you have enough time, like for me it's in the summer, when I have enough time to do everything that I want to do, what do you do? Like, can you take us through a day and tell me, like, what does that look like? Because the specific focus is, how do you encounter God daily? What does that look like? What are your practices?
Well, it's such a beautiful question. I'm really grateful for it. And I think in the Sufi tradition, we oftentimes, perhaps in other traditions too, reserve a place of secret, of a kind of secret of relationship with God that is maybe too personal to be shared. And so I'm happy to answer this question with a caveat that there are some things that I just probably will keep sacred. So, you know, we do have a long tradition of, in the Sufi lineages, almost all the Sufi lineages have a long tradition of retreat. And so that would be the ideal situation. And those retreats can be, you know, as brief as a breath, and they can be as long as, 40 days is the traditional long retreat. And during those time periods, a day would involve all sorts of practice, breathing, walking, perhaps chanting, certainly prayer, the standard prayers, depending on the lineage. That could look a lot of different ways. But in my daily life, I feel grateful that somehow I've been given a body which likes to wake up early, and that coincidentally is the time of day when the world is quiet and there's a lot of space. And so, in addition to what we might call formulaic prayers, the Salat prayers, any particular Sufi practitioner may have a series of practices that are offered by their sheikh, by their guide, by their teacher, that they engage in every day, and those typically look like prayers of recitation of the beautiful names of Allah, which is very similar to a mantra practice like you might find in some other traditions. Practice of zikr, which is the remembrance of God, which often has a very set prayer phrase combined with intention, with a clear intention that is used. The metaphor we use is we say we're polishing the heart in that. So that's definitely part of the practice. For me in my life, I've always lived far enough away from my job that it's a long walk to work, and not too far away that I can't walk to work. And so that means that in my schedule is typically 45 minutes or so of walking, and walking is a perfect time for the practice of zikr, for song, for close communion. And then ideally, as I'm sure is the case in many mystical lineages of other faith traditions, we are working as dervishes, as Sufi students, to remember God in the heart with every breath. And so the practice can be a continual practice for people, with always the caveat that when our minds go astray, bringing it back to the source again with loving attention, with deep forgiveness, and every breath is a prayer. And then, of course, there are other prayers during the day. There's evening time is another beautiful time for that, and before bed, to fall into bed after that kind of spiritual intimacy with one's beloved. We often refer to God as the beloved friend, or the dearest one, the closest one. That's sort of what all of that looks like. I hope that's a useful answer for you.
You brought up several things that I want to go after for a little more clarity, but thinking about one of the last things you said, for people that want to start some kind of practice, you said if the mind wanders, you bring it back. Can you talk about that for a second? Because that's something that that's across different traditions. When you get involved in meditative practices, the first thing that anyone encounters when they try to sit is the mind wanders. So what are the practices? And everybody all knows that the first reaction is, I got to be mystical right now. Get back on track or whatever, right? And so tell us about some of the disciplines that you do.
Sure. There are several ways to talk about that. In the particular lineage of Sufism that I'm in, one of the major figures is a man named Hazrat Inayat Khan, a great musician who came from India, the first part of the 20th century. And so he laid out a very clear series of practices for his students. And generally speaking, within a particular sphere of these practices, which we might call something like the meditative sphere, or something like that, his practices of concentration and contemplation and meditation. And the concentration ones he thought were super important. And so they're very brief practices usually when we start, but they're practices that are designed to really train our ability to stay one-pointed on something. And oftentimes there's an image or a thought, something that we hold completely in our concentration, and then gradually progress and develop that as a strength. So that's one way of looking at it. What I sometimes think of as like the hard eyes version of it, which is one-pointedness. But I think also one of the beautiful names of Allah is Ar-Raqib. Ar-Raqib is, I forget what the traditional translation is, probably the vigilant or something like that. I think of it as the lovingly vigilant, often compared to a parent watching over a sleeping child. And so part of Ar-Raqib and the practice of muraqabah, which comes from the same source, is this vigilance that comes from a place of love, a channel of love that comes from Allah, comes from God, moves through us, goes out into the world, meets whatever our shortcomings are, and wipes them away continuously with every breath. So in terms of advice for people who are starting on a path, the Sufis would say, first find a wise person. Find a wise person and sit with them. And maybe second, cut yourself some slack, you know? Like, recognize that it's a lifelong process, and you start from where you are, as my teacher always quotes from her Buddhist training. Start from where you are. Find someone that you trust who can help guide you on the path, and that's a good place to start from. Yeah.
This is sort of an aside, but I think it's an interesting part about Sufism in general. All Sufi practitioners that I know can trace their lineage back to the Prophet. That's an important thing. Like, can you do that off the top of your head? No. But I mean, speak to that. Do you think someone that's starting, do you think they should find a teacher?
Yes, I mean, this is my personal experience, and I don't want to discount the possibility that we would probably say that every soul has its own path, toward, whatever the most direct path is to where they're going. It belongs to that soul and to the divine and their relationship. And there's no doubt in my life, having a wise person who's been down their path and has seen all of the amazing cleverness and trickery of the ego at work in every capacity, who has stepped in all of the dog leavings along the way and can point those things out. We all have our own obstacles on the path. That to me, that's indispensable, and that's where the lineage you're talking about, what we call the silsila, the chain, that comes from Angel Gabriel and all the way down the line, is that's really what it is. It's a catalog of love. It's a catalog of sweet personal friendship, relationship of wise elders helping to guide and lead their friends on their path, and so it's this gift that just keeps getting passed down through the years. I think in my case, it's been indispensable, but there are some great Sufis in history. Ibn Arabi, who's often called the greatest sheikh, Sheikh al-Akbar, who, as far as we know, was not really in a particular tariqah, in a lineage, but nevertheless contributed immeasurably to Sufism, to the Tasawwuf as a whole. So, yeah.
In our relationship, sometimes over the course of the past few years, I've asked you some fairly technical questions, some sort of technical, theological kinds of questions. And this is not only true of you, but of other Sufis that I've listened to. Every time I come with a sort of technical question, there's always this refocusing that says, I can give you an answer to that, but I don't want to speak for you, but I can give you an answer for that. But in Sufism, the emphasis is always going to be on the personal experience over any sort of those tendencies, especially in Western culture, of coming at spirituality in a sort of propositional format to say this, and this. But and it's often talked about this openness of heart with this experience. So I would just like you, because that's one of the ways that you've helped me most in my personal life, is always to like keep that thing of openness of heart at the center of what I'm doing rather than approaching things propositionally. So I would just like you to ramble about that for a minute.
This is a dangerous proposition. You know I'm a professor in my day job, right? To invite a professor to ramble. It's yeah, so I think it was Al-Ghazali, who was a great medieval Sufi thinker who formulated the statement, but forgive me, I stumble off, I'm wrong about this, who said, Sufism is about experiences, not premises. And Murshid Samuel Lewis, one of the early American Sufi teachers, quoted this a lot, I'm told. Rumi also says, intellect will get you to the door, but it will not invite you into the house. And there's no doubt that the human brain, both particularly its capacity for imagination and also its intellect, are wonderful tools for creating a framework within which to begin a journey, to structure a life in a way that is in keeping with our understanding of moral principles. And when we'll see if this metaphor works, when we travel to Venice, it's useful to have a guidebook. It's useful to be able to read so you can read the guidebook because it's a confusing city. But if we travel to Venice, in order to be able to write a guidebook about Venice, we may be missing something there. And no words, no concepts will describe our knowing of sitting on a bench in Piazza San Marco with the gulls and the crowds and the church eating watermelon sorbetto. That experience is a lived experience. And if you'll forgive me by sort of then extrapolating into this quality of closeness with God, of intimacy, of friendship with God, that experience, that state, is one that we like to say occupies a space that we associate with the heart, and we have many words for the heart, many different subtle centers that are associated with, some of which are sort of the seat of the ego, some of which are the seat of knowing, and others which, one of them is called the sir, which simply means the secret. It's this place that is beyond concept. It is we say sometimes the throne, the arsh of Allah within the human being. And that's something that is an experience that can't be put into words, can't be formulated, and you can't get there, as far as I've experienced, you can't get there by thinking your way there. So I would say that it's not that Sufism, I think most of us know that many of the greatest scientific and philosophical minds of the Middle Ages were certainly part of the Muslim world, particularly in the Golden Age of Spain. But many, I'm not going to say most because I just don't know, they were also Sufi practitioners. And so in addition to that intellect that they were working with, there was an understanding that at some point you go back into this place where vast landscapes of knowing, actual knowing, not learning, accumulate. I hope that's an accurate portrayal.
I'm just going to give you one last quick one that I was thinking about this week, and I'm sorry I didn't warn you about this before, but it just occurred to me that since we're doing this and having this conversation in a church, a lot of Sufis talk about Jesus a lot, which for those Christians that are here that aren't familiar with Muslim community might seem a little bit odd. So could you just talk about where Jesus fits in the Sufi, I know you could go all night, but.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So, sure, I'll say something about Jesus. Jesus has there's a beautiful epithet for Jesus among Sufis, Ruh Allah, which literally means the breath of Allah, the breath of God. And Jesus is throughout the Quran, and particularly in our lineage, which is very much an interfaith lineage, one that accepts seekers from all different faiths and celebrates all of the messengers of Allah. Jesus is deeply, deeply revered, as is Mother Mary, as are other figures from other world traditions. But Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke of Jesus with such reverence and such a sense of brotherhood. It was very clear, the Quran is very clear that, as I think I've mentioned to you before, there's this beautiful surah called the Surah Al-Ikhlas, where it says that Allah is neither begotten nor does Allah beget. The sense of a Christian sense of Jesus as the only begotten Son of God that's not present in traditional Sufi thinking, but Jesus is definitely revered and was revered from the very beginning of the Muhammadi sort of message. Yeah, is that useful?
Lastly, do we need to say anything about this music before we sing? I dread to ask that because there's almost nothing more tedious to me than listening to composers talking about their music in general. I think composers should just let their music go, but sometimes it helps people to get a way in. Is there anything you need to say about it?
So the text for this comes from a dear friend of ours, Sadi Neil Douglas Klotz, who is a Sufi teacher who lives in Scotland, although American by birth, and one of his great lifelong practices is the unfolding of sacred texts from the Semitic sacred languages, so Aramaic and Hebrew, but also earlier Canaanite and early Egyptian texts. But in this case, what we have is he asked me to call it a meditation, so we'll call it a meditation. It probably belongs, from my estimation, in the tradition of Talwil, which is a kind of esoteric commentary, a sort of unfolding of the text. So it belongs to a really precious ayat, a particular verse from the Quran that's referred to as the verse of light, ayat an-nur, which is this mystical gem in the heart of the Quran that likens Allah to this impossible to describe light and unfolds in all these really beautiful ways. So that's what we're listening to. It's really, really hard, and they're so incredibly awesome, and I'm just so grateful to know wonderful, deep musicians who could actually tackle a piece like this. So I'm very grateful to you.
There's no pressure. Xavier is grateful after we finish. Come on, Sarah.
who's more exhausted, me or you, after that. Probably you. Oh, so wonderful. See if I can collect my thoughts. One of the great joys, I think, about being composers is that on some occasions we get to sit and hear music that was part of our own practice, our own musical practice, being realized and made into all of these compressing and rarefying particles of air. It's really an overwhelming experience, and because of that, I'm actually going to look at my notes so that I don't forget. But okay, I've stalled enough now. I think you've got enough time to get your breath back. I'm so grateful for the generous way in which you've talked about the conversations we've had over the years, and I share that, and part of why I feel so honored to be invited to have this conversation with you. As someone myself who grew up in a Protestant Christian church, and who didn't see much evidence of mysticism in that tradition, I wonder if we might just start by asking a question about how your daily prayer practice, your morning time, your study, how did all of this begin coming out of that particular tradition?
It's a great question, and I don't want to slight anyone, but I think that you very correctly say that within Protestantism, the mystical element is not very emphasized, and so most of us that have gotten into the more mystical parts of the tradition have looked through the two monastic practices in both the East and the Western tradition. Even in the Western tradition in general, the mystical side of things has been more not emphasized as it has been in the East. And I think I told you recently, there's a great story at the end of Seven Storey Mountain where Thomas Merton is he's decided that he's going to go to India to study meditation and mysticism in the Hindu tradition, and he tells this to one of his Hindu friends, and his Hindu friend says, well, why don't you study the mystical tradition within your own tradition first before you go to India to study it? And he's like, the what? I didn't ever know there was such a thing as a mystical side of Christianity. For me in particular, the possible exception to that is the Episcopal Church on the Protestant side of things. There's some small, very, very tiny pockets of Lutheranism where this still happens. But in the Episcopal Church, we do have that monastic tradition, and I have friends that are Benedictine monks in the Episcopal side of things. I worked in an Episcopal church for a year, and it was kind of that revelation. The rector's wife was a contemplative. I had never been exposed to that before, and she started giving me some books, and I was like, what is this? And then I had to leave to take a different job because of financial reasons, and I missed the liturgy a lot, so I started saying morning prayer. Those of you that are outside of the tradition, in the monastic practices, they pray 7 times a day, and when they were developing our prayer book, which is the little red book in your hymnal in front of you, Thomas Cranmer sort of jammed some of those monastic services together for people that might not have enough time. So I started saying morning prayer every day, and then at the same time that I started doing that, I started finding some literature on contemplative practices, how to sit and meditate. Especially at the beginning, I was doing a practice called Lectio Divina, where you use a small passage of scripture as your mantra sort of for the day. And that was like almost 25, 30 years ago now that we're talking. And, as I started doing that every day, it sort of expanded in practice to where I was doing the noonday prayer, the evening prayer, the Compline. Compline's the one you say right before bed. We talked about that one earlier with you. And then it just started expanding the sitting practice, and I'm also a big walker like you. So I start my day, actually my practice now, I start my day with a 20 or 30-minute walk. It's usually divided in half. I usually use the first half of that just to do the Jesus prayer and sort of see where my mind is going. The Jesus prayer, for those of you that don't know, is more emphasized in the eastern part of the church, but it comes from a passage of scripture. It just says, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us. That's the form that I use. And then on the way back, on the second half of that morning walk, I make a specific discipline of being thankful for stuff because I'm not naturally grateful and thankful. So I have to have that discipline of doing this every morning and going through and being thankful for the people that are in my life, experiences in my life. So I sort of do that. And I do another walk in the evening after evening prayer when I have time to do that stuff. So that's kind of how I fell into it, and it's grown and changed over the years a lot. So there's much more silence now than there was in the beginning. So.
At the end there, at the very end, you raised the question of silence and how that works. And I wonder if you might, this is, completely off the cuff from my perspective, but I'm curious about what the intersection for you is between silence and prayer. You mentioned that the Jesus prayer coming from Scripture, and as we spoke about, that's a prayer that I've worked with as well. And how is silence prayer for you? And is there silence contained within prayer that is based in words as well?
Kind of taking off from what you said earlier, the ultimate end of our life is not to see prayer as something that we're doing, but in the Christian tradition we talk about your life becoming a prayer at every moment, so that you're experiencing that at all time. There's a very real way in which, oh look, our light came on in the back. Okay. I better say something significant now since the light came on. You know how you said you couldn't tell me everything because there's some secret parts. Julian of Norwich, who's one of my favorite saints, says at one point when she's talking about her experience of God, I can't tell you what it's like because it's not like anything else. There's no analogy for it because it's not like anything else. And so I can only sort of feel around the edges to tell you what's going on. I know that in my life I've gone away from the practice of using scripture as mantra. I've talked to monk friends about this. This is apparently a normal thing that goes. I'm still involved in the scriptures and the daily readings and all of that stuff, but when I'm sitting, I don't seem to need that mantra to settle my mind in the same way that I can get to a silent place. We can talk about it sort of, I don't know how you describe it. You get to a place, I mean, the Buddhists would say I'm getting to a place where I'm being instead of doing something. And in some real senses, I'm not trying to do anything when I go to those places of silence. It feels like, I'm just breathing in God and breathing out God. That's what it feels. I don't know how to describe it other than that I'm just sitting and being. And I'm definitely, I don't think it's a Buddhist way, because in the Buddhist they have that big emptying thing, and I feel like I'm in the presence of, you know what I mean? It's a dialogue of sorts, so, yeah.
That's beautiful. And as I'm imagining this from a Christian perspective, I'm really curious about, let me frame it this way. Perhaps from a Sufi tradition, we might say that that the Sufi path leads toward a state of fana, of the annihilation of the false self in the real, is the way that an icon put it. it sounds to me like the sort of presence, the knowing that you're describing is filled with presence. And is that Christ? Is that the presence that you're with? What is Christ in that capacity?
Right. So in any tradition where there's meditation and silence, there are these paths of saying we have the sort of popular cultural notion of what the ego is, and that's a separate thing. But I'm talking about ego in that real sense of this is my experience of myself and who I believe that I am. At some point, even that starts to get stripped away. And in the Christian tradition, you know, let me say it this way. In the Vedantic tradition, they call that the watcher, right? There's this thing that's going on that's beyond your conscious self. The Buddhists like to call it the non-self. In Christian terms, what we say is, we go with St. Paul to say, it is no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. And so that sense of the self gets gradually pulled away. And I don't know, over the course of my life, Forrest, every time like I've made a line in the sand and said, I'm a this, I'm an organist, I'm a musician, I'm a whatever line I make, eventually that gets pulled away too, and it turns out that it's something that you could ultimately lay down if you had to. You know what I mean? Yeah. So.
Thanks, that's beautiful. And 1,000 questions keep coming up, and I want to turn to the text that you set tonight, which is from the Song of Solomon. Anglicans and Episcopalians call it Song of Solomon, yeah? Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, which I think for many traditions that I'm aware of are a real, are one of the most pure and revered expressions of mystical love. And so far in your description of this, I haven't heard the word love come up, and I'm curious whether love is either as a concept or as an experience is part of this the stripping away, the emptying out, the being filled. Is that an experience of love, or is it just an experience? How do you feel that?
Let me tell some personal background again. With Song of Solomon, it's a weird thing in the Bible that we have a book of erotic poetry, and pretty graphic erotic poetry, right in the center of the book. And I can tell you that as someone who is raised in a fairly conservative Christian environment, that was the only thing we had to do for fun sometimes, is sneak into the bedroom and sneak into my, you think it's a joke, but it wasn't when I was a teenager. Sometimes I'd sneak into my bedroom to read the Song of Solomon. And then you're taught pretty early on in certain Protestant circles that there are different Greek words for love, that there is eros for erotic love, that there's philos for friendship love, and I've recently learned that the demonic way to say it is agape, which agape, that's how they taught us to say it, but is the love of God. And that's the highest love. What's interesting is that as you get into the more mystical traditions, the analogy that especially the church fathers use more often than not about our relationship with God is one of erotic love. And that's really true in all mystical traditions, that there is this analogy of erotic love for God, in that way that the real analogy that we are using when we talk about our relationship with God is that of a lover that steals our hearts. And I think that's a good analogy, but like I was saying to you recently, I think we have to be very, very careful about reading text simply allegorically and saying, okay, we have erotic love poetry, it's really talking about God. But as if your daily life was something that was, what I would say about that is I'm very suspicious now of categories of natural and supernatural. I don't find that my relationship with you, my relationship with my wife, my relationship with God are like these super separate categories that I can sort of demarcate out and say, oh, because I'm reading this text as an allegory for my love of God, that it doesn't somehow also equally apply to my relationship with other people. I don't know if that makes sense, but yes, heart stolen by love, yes, all of that stuff. I didn't know how deep we were going into love talk tonight.
I think all the Sufis in the audience are really digging on that. That's really good. Oh yeah, yeah. We call that kind of love ish. Yeah.
A lot of monks use. You seduced me, and I was seduced. You seduced me, and I was seduced, and that's a good. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And you mentioned the notion that this isn't necessarily a metaphor. It's not a stand-in for it, but it's real. That all levels of experience. It sounds like you're saying there's a kind of almost like a telescoping attention of exactly what realm and what plane this love is taking place in, but the same love either way. Yeah.
I promise I'll stop talking. But for anybody that wants to start a practice, here's one of the first things that I learned. I was trying to sit, and when you first start trying to sit and not do anything for, it feels like an eternity, you know? And I was just trying to sit for about 15 minutes, and I had a cat at the time, and whenever I would sit, the cat would come up and start messing with me and scratching me and wanting to be petted. And right away, always I was like, go away, cat, I'm trying to be mystical right now, I'm trying to pray. Right, and then that way of distraction, all of a sudden you go, wait a minute, God's coming to me in my cat right now to teach me to experience God in all things. Instead of, I don't need to push this away, I have to just incorporate it into the practice, so yeah.
Maybe one last question. How would you suggest people get started? It sounds like you've gone on a long journey of transformation in your practice, and I imagine some people think about spending an entire day practicing, and they have echoes of when they were a kid in Suzuki violin and had to sit there sawing away. I think the former concertmaster in the back row is definitely feeling that one. So what?
The teacher element is not quite as big on the Christian side, though there are plenty of spiritual directors that you can find. There is also that part, not only within the Christian tradition, but even I think in the Sufi tradition and others, that when you need a teacher, one will appear as you need it. I didn't really ever find a teacher, and all of the spiritual directors I've gone to have said, you'd be a really hard person to be a spiritual director for. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but that's what they tell me. So I've had to sort of compile mine from different needs from different people. But the one thing I can tell you is I think that you have to have, I mean, the consistency is the thing, and it's better to try sitting for 5 minutes a day and just do that for a month, and then you'll see that it'll grow to 10 minutes. I think it's important to have some sort of formal element to keep that balance so that you're not just sort of flying around on your own. So that's why I use the structured prayers and the other ones. But there's an easy way to start. But I mean, if you just give yourself a little bit of time and do it consistently, it'll grow on its own accord from there. That's what I would say. So, want to hear some more music? Okay.
when I grow up one day, I'm going to have talent like you guys. It's amazing, an amazing gift to all of us. Thank you for offering that. So I said that we would have a time for questions and answers. So if you've been thinking of that, I'll take your questions and then I'll try to repeat them so that everybody gets a chance to hear them. But I wonder, Forrest and Kurt, you've generously modeled your friendship for us and your sharing of your prayer lives and the sharing of so much of who you are and how you understand the world to be. But at the beginning, Kurt, you alluded to the disagreements that you both have, and I noticed that we didn't really talk about that. I don't know that my question is about what. I imagine we probably have a pretty good guess about what, but rather how, right? How has your relationship, how have you chosen to engage disagreement in a way that moves closer toward one another? And how has that changed the friendship that you share? Perhaps deepened, strengthened, whatever it might be. I wonder if you could talk us through that side of the disagreement as opposed to a topical disagreement.
This was a few years back. I've always had the sense when I'm sitting in silence that God isn't a fixed hard point, but that there's motion. I experience motion. I don't know how to, I can use technical theological language which would bore you to death. And that's part of my Trinitarian convictions. And so I asked Forrest about it. I'm like, what are you, I know you have to experience this too. I know you can't experience the silence in the same way and feel like there's this fixed point. And so I just asked him about, how do you understand that sense of motion in God and the silence? And he gave me a good explanation of the Sufi understanding of where that's coming from. So that's kind of, I'm always going to come from a more Trinitarian place, and he's going to come from a not. But we can talk about that stuff, So I don't know if you want to add.
I think it's a lovely example because that is something, I have deep respect for the theology that leads to a Trinitarian perspective on things. And and at the same time, there's God is one, Allahu Ahad. There are many ways of looking at that, but my experience, for me personally, my own experience in prayer and meditation is that I have only ever seen 0 or 1, and not 3, and so that still eludes me. And at the same time, another one that we've talked about too is the notion of the person of God the Father, and certainly I think most folks on a Sufi path would recognize a kind of deep parental love of God, but the gendering of God is something that I haven't experienced. I don't have a feeling of the gendering of God from my own experience, and yet I do have this deep respect for both the tradition and Kurt's experience in that regard. So the disagreement, one thing I can say is that I have never personally felt any sense of conflict in my relationship with you. There are certain composers that I'm sure we would disagree on, and there are, certain pedagogical approaches, things like that. But the conflict when it comes, I feel like, as a lot of mystics do, that there's a place inside. Rumi puts it this way, out beyond ideas of right doing, wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And it doesn't matter what direction we approach the field from, which fence we hop over to get there.
Yes, and I would say to Forrest, that field is Jesus, and we'll eventually meet there.
And Sufis would say, fine, sounds good.
What about all of you? What's been on your heart, Deanna?
This is more of a compositional question. So what I was really struck by when the program before the talk started, you said a text that's very non-traditionally. Thank you. So the text that you've set is a very non-traditional text as far as vocal music goes. We have this huge lexicon of lead or song that's usually set to metrical poetry. And as a singer and the soon-to-be wife of a poet, I'm always kind of fascinated with how those two traditions have kind of evolved together. But this is completely different. You've set a commentary on scripture, which is very not formally similar to poetry. But as I was listening, I could hear that every single word, the way that you composed the vocal line, was very indicative of how you inside felt about that word in the context that it was in and what that meant to you. That was just what I heard. So I guess my question is, how did you do that? Because you have lots of experience composing. You're a composition professor. This I'm sure is not the first time you've set a non-poetic text. But how did you sort of come to the idea of, oh, I'm going to set this in particular? And can you speak to that?
Thank you. And I'm really honored and glad that the piece touched you in that particular way and that you had that experience of hearing it. Yeah, I guess I feel like it is a deeply poetic text, but it's certainly, you're right, it's not in a verse form. It unfolds in prose and unpacks all of these different meanings that are contained within the Arabic roots that are in the original, which is actually much briefer than this. It's a much shorter text. For me in composing this, what I'm after is just an exploration of what light is and what we mean by light, both in our tradition and in other mystical traditions. We talk a lot about in the Chishtiya lineage, which many of the great musicians of India have come through. We talk a lot about vibration, sort of the motion, right, at the core of things, this vibration, it's sort of a Brownian motion that's constantly operating underneath, and that everything from light to sound to even to the soul itself in this cosmology is in fact a vibratory emanation of this source. And the metaphor that Sufis often use is light. And one of the beautiful names of God is An-Nur. And we speak about the Nur Muhammadi, this kind of primordial light. Let there be light. Fiat lux. This is a thing. What is that? What is that? What is this? I don't know. So the organ is like, for me, like the text, I'm setting every single thing the way I want it to be, but it's almost an excuse for there to be this kind of emanation from this primordial source that's like hovering around it all and covering it all. That's what I'm after. And in the middle is just like, it's straight up Qawwali music. I mean, it's just, and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan like goes to town on light upon light, which is like, so, it's improvisatory and intuitive, and I'm just trying to capture a particular color of this text. I hope that's a useful answer. There's no real formula to it. But.
What else? Oh, I'm just decided to run around with the microphone instead, since these questions are brilliant.
That was a wonderful experience. Thank you both, musically and otherwise. Just a question I was wondering as you're speaking about mysticism and contemplation. I don't know if you think you might have been predisposed towards this spiritual path one way or another in life. Would you recognize, like for different kinds of people, there might be different ways to go, even within your own spiritualities? And what might be, if you encounter someone, if mysticism doesn't suit them, what might be some other ways you would suggest? Or
It's an excellent question, and I certainly don't think that everyone is called to the same kind of practice that I have, where you're going to spend 3 hours of your day doing this stuff. And not everyone can, because people have jobs and things that they have to do. I think it's good for everyone to have some kind of practice of silence. But sometimes that doesn't work, and it doesn't work for every person. And a few years ago, I had a friend who did have that experience. He did have that sort of bent towards contemplation, and he went through a horrible year. He was dealing with a lot of loss in his life and all of that. He said, I don't know what to do because I've gone to services, I've prayed, I can't find God anymore. I can't find God in that way by sitting in quiet. I can't find it in corporate worship. I can't even find it in singing. And that happens sometimes. And I always tell people the same thing. Come to the food pantry at St. Paul's and hand out food to poor people, because then you don't have to wonder where God is, because he's going to be right in front of you. Or if you want me to non-gender it, God's going to be right in front of you. We're going to have that discussion later. I can tell you that. But yeah, serve the poor, and then you'll find God that way. If you don't find God in sitting in silence, you can definitely find God in serving the poor. I don't know what else you would say to that.
I'm not sure there's much more to say about that. I guess I would say my experience of Sufism and the Sufis that I know, if I lined up my 35 random beautiful friends who are on the Sufi path, that their work in the world would look differently. Every single one of them would look completely different. Their path is completely different. Counselors and librarians and elementary school teachers and people doing every kind of work in the world and working to integrate their work, their spiritual life with that. For people who aren't mystics, that just means you're a person who's not a mystic. That's really all it means. That's, and it's great. I mean, it's like I think we, in some ways, like, if one is able or is working toward or aspires toward seeing God in every being, every particle of creation, that can be an extremely hard and painful road. And I can't imagine that it wouldn't even be more painful and more difficult if that wasn't your path to be on. So, I love this answer. This is so beautiful. And I think also building actual bridges out of concrete is a great spiritual path. And I think being of service in any capacity in the world is a great path to be on. And fundamentally, at some point in time, just being you is a spiritual path to be on. We're all, in our cosmology, all of us are emanations, are activities of God, here vibrating together. And if God didn't want to be here as us, God wouldn't be. So here we are. We can just be however this plays out in this particular lifetime. And I suspect anyone who asks a question like that is likely to be doing some serious work.
And I would just add at the end, one of the first things that you find out when you start a practice of any sort is that you start believing that you're a pretty spiritual person. And that's one of the first things that gets sort of stripped away. It doesn't get you, it's not magical. You're not doing an incantation that conjures the presence of God. And there are always people, at least in our tradition, we have people like Brother Lawrence, who is not a mystic, and we're like, yeah, I say the prayers because we're supposed to say the prayers, but I really find God more in washing dishes than anything, and so there are other ways to do it than that. So.
I'm reminded in the Episcopal Church or in any ordered worship tradition, right? We call these things liturgies, which is a term that sometimes gets translated as the work of the people, and that's a mistranslation. A better translation is something like a public work, right? Like the water system in a city, or electricity in a city. We over here on Main Street are very aware of our public works out here. The point for me, I guess, is just that kind of undergirding essential aspect of the prayers that we have, right? That's not seen, but is sustaining, right? It's not this conjuring of a thing that's going to appear in front of us necessarily, but it is the thing that enables the life to actually happen, right? It's okay if I don't have any questions. Oh, there is. Okay, great. Do you want to? Well, it's easier if we give you a microphone because there's people that are joining us, I'm sure, on the live stream somewhere, and they might want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the music. I would like to ask something which might be a difficult question. I hope it is not. And it's how does that path into spirituality shape your approach to music, to your musical life, your musical practice? Thank you.
We'll maybe call this the last one, and then we can have some other conversation if you'd like to afterwards.
I think for me, it began the other way around, as a musician, and there was a sense of sort of longing in the music making for a way of making music or a reason for making music that seemed to, that had what I would call a purpose that was tuned to who I was as a human. And then I was walking through a bookstore in Cambridge, England, and this book just sort of jumped off the shelf at me, and it was called The Mysticism of Sound and Music by Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was sort of the founder of this particular branch of Sufism in which I practice. And so it kind of began backwards, and then things sort of turned on their head after a while. My music became simpler, clearer, started to reflect more and more the activities of my practice and sort of the practices of my lineage, which involves a lot of singing, and a lot of singing of very simple tunes with very simple words that carry a lot of freight. And so, the music of mine, which began, this was a complicated piece, but started very complex, became more and more transparent, more and more straightforward, and then eventually these very simple tunes started to come through me. And the work I have right now is in figuring out how to integrate these very simple tunes into the world of music making. So there's that. And then also, singing is so amazing. Singing is such an incredible practice. It's a spiritual practice in and of itself to cause your very own sternum to vibrate in tune with one's emotions, with one's other fellow human beings. And that's a joyful act of service, to be able to create music that allows other human beings to do that. So those are some ways in which, and then I think there are also sort of deeper kind of mystical things, but from a practical standpoint, I think it's a beautiful way to be of service and to explore and to notice, to watch how you yourself change over time. And, inshallah, you become a little more ripe as you go.
Now he hands the mic to me after that beautiful answer. This is one of the questions that Forrest said he was going to ask me, and I was dreading it all night. So I was glad it didn't come up, so thanks for bringing it up at the end. I don't know. Every time I write something, like even now when I was just playing that thing, I thought, where in the world did this come from? And I think that in a certain sense, that's true for everybody that writes music, that there's some, like people always say, because people want you to say, well, my dog died, so I wrote an F sharp here or whatever, and they want to make those connections. But I mean, there's a fundamental thing where I don't really understand how I do that stuff, you know what I mean? And I know that there is a connection between my practice and the musical stuff, but I'm hesitant to accept my own conclusions about that, because, I mean, my wife's sitting up here in the front, and if you ask her why I do anything, she will tell you he has no idea why he does half the things he does. And that's probably pretty true. So I'm a little hesitant to, I know that there's a connection, but I don't exactly know how it works. That's what I'll say about that.
Well, thank you to all of you. First of all, thank you for trusting us at St. Paul's. For those of you who are not familiar with us or this place, thank you for trusting us to have this conversation and for being here. Thank you to the two of you for modeling a real generosity of spirit and a generosity of care for one another, a real friendship that I believe is healing for this world, and a real deep faith. Thank you for your gifts of composition and music. Sarah, thank you so much. Would you join me in a round of applause for these two? Thank you all for being here. I think we're here for a little bit if you'd like to come and share a conversation, but thank you all for being here.